So then the government had a whole page about is 60% the right level. Now, they should probably know the answer to this, because you can go along and, I mean, we've got some of the best climate science institutes here in the world here. You ask the Tyndall Centre, is 60% enough? They say quite unequivocally, no, 60% isn't enough. It's nowhere near enough. Also, they had all those responses, didn't they? It was a consultation, and you know, I think it was around 86% of those responses said it's not enough. So that's quite a clear signal. However, they prevaricate, say, "Ooh, things are tough." They talk about concentration targets which in no way match up to their 60%. So it's misleading. Yeah, it's definitely misleading. And then they come up with one sentence in the whole page which actually sums up their whole position. But they've masked it in a whole page of writing. The whole position is, we are mindful of the fact that climate change is a global problem which demands a global solution. Now, you're not going to find anyone who can actually argue with that. It's a truism. We know that climate change, global warming, is a global issue. So we need a global solution. However, I would like to point out one thing. We have a climate bill, right? This isn't an international effort, this is a UK effort. By the time you've accepted that we need a climate bill, you've also accepted that we've got responsibility to act. So we're not talking about what's effective, but what is morally required for us to do. And incidentally, this of course makes international negotiations far easier when you can show leadership rather than rhetoric. Then they go on to, then they say, okay, we're being generous, we're going to ask the Climate Committee to look at whether 60% is good enough. To which they already know the answer because of their consultation. The Climate Committee, they've actually got quite a few good clauses in here, including the committee hires most of its own members, apart from the first few who are appointed. From then on, it hires its own members, so that's quite good. The funding is secured and so on. You know, we have got a chance that it's going to be reasonably independent, so it probably will come up with the answer that no, 60% isn't sufficient. However, this is the real kicker. We intend that the committee should undertake this work, answering the question, as soon as it has made recommendations on the 3 budgets and should report by autumn 2009. So they've kicked this into the long grass, but not only have they kicked it into the long grass, namely 2009, but the first 3 budgetary periods, which are 5 years each, will already have been decided upon. So if we're saying that 60% isn't enough, and it's going to be 80% or 90% by 2050, then the first 3 budgetary periods are going to be set for the old, outdated, inadequate target, right? Which they then might not meet anyway. So then, after the first 15 years, the slope is going to go from gently up to something like that. And if you think that that's sort of a sensible pathway if you want economic growth in the country, then, you know, I think you're far mistaken. Then they go on to talk about aviation, and they use all sorts of excuses for aviation. They say, we're going to try and negotiate something at the UNFCCC. Of course, they couldn't do that with Kyoto, which is why it's not under the United Nations, under Kyoto Protocol. It's the people in charge of International Civil Aviation Authority, which is basically just a group of airlines. You know, they're not going to regulate themselves. It's stupid to assume they would. I mean, they've got nothing to lose by slowly raising the efficiency of aircraft. But slowly raising the efficiency of aircraft when you've got, you know, 8% or 10% growth is annual growth is not the sort of thing that's actually going to limit emissions. So UN didn't work on this, and you know, it shows no signs of, as far as I can see. The International Civil Aviation Authority can't be expected to. It's the wrong forum for this to be decided. It's basically an industry group. What else can we do? The EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme in Europe. Well, possibly that can work. That can be by 2012. But again, greatest challenge of a generation. Why are we waiting until 2012? That's absurd. Let's get this done now. Also, if we build all these airports and then in 2012 emission trading comes in and it adds a cost to aviation, and the number of people flying limits or decreases, then all that capacity is just going to be wasted. But people are still going to have lost their homes. You know, everyone's home's going to be flattened by that point. So that doesn't look like a... I mean, and then they've got this brilliant excuse: there's not an internationally accepted way of determining who's responsible for which emissions. Now, in the UK there is actually a slight difference between how many flights, the emissions of flights going abroad and emissions of flights coming into the UK. There are various sort of arguments can be made, or are we responsible for citizens? Or are we responsible for just half of flights coming in and out, that sort of thing. But none of this is important. It's not even remotely important. We just need to take on a methodology and say half of flights in, half of flights out. That's pretty good. It might be a couple % here or there, but we're not completely omitting the fastest growing sector in the economy. We're not that stupid. So then after saying all this, oh, we can't do it for this reason, and then they say there's not an international agreement on how to do this, we need to make it workable. They also talk about how difficult it's going to be for other sectors because the targets are going to be more stringent, i.e., fuck, this might actually achieve something. You know, we might actually have to reduce emissions. You know, that's worrying, isn't it? Are we heading for a low carbon economy? Jeez. You know, they're just not prepared to take it on. And then at the end they say, oh, by the way, the Secretary of State will have to report annually on international aviation as set out by the UNFCCC. So apparently there already is a methodology for reporting international aviation emissions. But that's not responsibility. And somehow international responsibility per country has to be settled before the UK can act, which is quite odd, you know, for domestic policy. You don't say, well, I'm not sure if we should use those antibiotics in our hospital because, you know, we haven't figured this out internationally yet. We don't know what the Americans doing. What about the Germans? I mean, the whole premise of this climate bill is that the UK is going to take a leadership role. A leadership role which is desperately needed from actually all developed nations, not just the UK. And it's really such a missed opportunity that the developed world hasn't moved ahead from the time of the Kyoto negotiations until now. Because how difficult is it to get India and China involved when the developed nations have so far only paid lip service? And there is a clear responsibility in terms of the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which is virtually all down to developed nations, although there's an increasing proportion going forward from developing countries. So we are clearly responsible, yet we haven't taken this action. And it would seem to be, you'd have to differentiate between commitments taken on by the developing and the developed world. So in terms of negotiations, we've got a really, really weak hand at the moment, and we need to strengthen that hand as much as we can, you know, the whole developed world, because, I mean, it's not India and China's responsibility to act, but we're damn well screwed if they don't, and we need to support them, and we also need to be in a position to show that we're committed ourselves.